Welcome to the Soul Love Stories channel. This channel will bring you powerful love stories between Korean men and Black women, filled with passion, tension, forbidden attraction, tender moments, and even dark sides. Enjoy listening. Please subscribe to the channel to hear more great stories. I stood in the center of the Park family conference room while 12 men studied me like a problem that had already been solved. The room smelled faintly of polished mahogany and expensive tea. Heavy curtains dimmed the Seattle afternoon outside, turning the long table into something that felt less like a meeting and more like a quiet courtroom. At the head of the table sat my husband, Park Jun-seok, the man who controlled half the shipping routes moving through the Pacific Northwest. His posture was perfectly straight, his hands folded loosely in front of him, his expression calm in the way powerful men learn to make their faces unreadable. To his right sat the only person in the room whose presence carried more weight than his, Madam Park, his mother, the architect of the organization long before Jun-seok inherited it. She wore a dark silk suit and a string of pearls that rested against her collarbone like quiet authority. When she looked at me, it was not with anger. It was with certainty. A thick folder lay open in front of the family lawyer. He adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and spoke carefully, as if each word had already been negotiated in advance. Federal authorities had seized one of our containers 3 weeks earlier. $42 million in electronics and pharmaceutical materials were now sitting in a government warehouse. The problem was not the loss of product. Loss happened in business. The real problem was that someone inside the organization had leaked protected financial information to investigators. Only a handful of people had access to the internal financial reports that connected the shipment to our companies. Then the lawyer said my name, Naomi Carter Park, the only person outside the operational leadership who had access to the records. Silence settled across the table. It was the kind of silence that told me everyone had already agreed on the answer before the meeting even began. Madam Park folded her hands neatly on the table and spoke with the calm tone of someone offering wisdom instead of accusation. She reminded the council that she had warned her son about allowing outsiders into family matters. Marriage, she explained, did not automatically create loyalty. Cultural differences created misunderstandings. Trust had to be earned slowly. Several of the men nodded. I looked at Jun-seok. I did not need him to defend me passionately. I did not even need him to challenge the accusation. One sentence would have been enough. A simple statement that his wife had never betrayed the family. But Jun-seok lowered his eyes toward the documents in front of him and said nothing. That was the moment I understood what my role had become. Not wife. Not partner. Evidence. After several minutes, the council reached its decision. For the stability of the organization, I would be removed from all financial oversight in internal communication systems. The announcement was delivered politely, as if it were an administrative adjustment rather than a judgment. I rose slowly from my chair. No anger touched my voice when I spoke. If that is what the council believes, then I respect the decision. No one noticed the small relief that settled quietly in my chest, because their decision had just given me exactly what I needed. Time. For 7 years I had lived inside the Park family empire without ever truly belonging to it. When I married Jun-seok, people outside the organization assumed I had stepped into power. They imagined wealth, influence, security. What they did not see was how carefully the walls of that world were arranged. I was allowed to host dinners, organize charity galas, and manage the social calendar that softened the family's public image. I greeted business partners with a polite smile and remembered the names of their wives. I made sure the house ran smoothly when the elders visited, and that Madam Park never had to repeat a request twice. Over time, those small responsibilities slowly replaced the career I once had. Before the marriage, I had worked as a forensic accountant for a consulting firm in Chicago. My job had been to follow money trails that corporations tried to hide. Numbers were my language. Patterns were the way I understood the world. When I moved to Seattle after the wedding, Jun-seok told me gently that my skills would still be useful. I could review some internal reports, help the family avoid financial mistakes. But as the years passed, my role shrank quietly. The men handled the business meetings. The lawyers handled the audits. I became the person who poured tea while they discussed strategy. At first I accepted it because I believed that was the cost of peace. The Park family was traditional and proud. Madam Park valued hierarchy above everything else. A daughter-in-law was expected to maintain harmony, not challenge the structure. Still, I paid attention. Old habits do not disappear just because someone asks politely. I noticed how money moved through the network of companies the family used to hide their operations. Shipping firms, consulting groups, investment funds that existed mostly on paper. Everything followed a rhythm. Payments entered one account, moved through 3 others, and eventually surfaced again as legitimate revenue. It was complicated but consistent. That was why the change stood out so clearly the night I first saw it. 3 months before the container seizure, I was reviewing a quarterly report that Junsiek's office had left on the kitchen counter. He often forgot documents around the house because he assumed no one else would study them. The transfer records caught my eye almost immediately. Small withdrawals were appearing across several subsidiary accounts. None of them were large enough to raise alarms individually. 10,000 here, 12,000 there. But the pattern repeated across more than a dozen companies. When I added the numbers together in my head, the total grew quickly. Nearly $2 million had moved out of the system within a few weeks. I brought the report to Junsiek that evening while he was finishing a phone call in his office. He listened politely as I explained what I had noticed, but the moment I suggested something was wrong, his expression shifted into patient dismissal. He told me the transfers were part of a strategy that I probably did not understand yet. Business structures like theirs required constant adjustment. The money would circle back eventually. I tried again the following week after another set of unusual transfers appeared. This time he did not even look at the documents. He only smiled and said that worrying about numbers was an old habit from my previous career. The tone was not cruel. It was gentle, almost affectionate. That somehow made it worse. I realized then that he had stopped seeing me as someone capable of understanding the financial system he controlled. So I stopped bringing him questions. Instead, I began quietly collecting answers. Late at night, after everyone else in the house had gone to sleep, I opened the financial databases from the tablet Junsiek rarely locked. I traced every small withdrawal back to its destination. The trail was complicated but not impossible to follow. Each transfer moved through layers of shell companies before landing in a single holding account registered under an offshore trust. The trust belonged to a charity foundation that Madam Park had created years earlier. On the surface, the foundation funded cultural programs and medical clinics. In reality, it had never moved money in this direction before. The moment I saw the account holder name on the final page of the transaction chain, a cold clarity settled over me. Madam Park. The discovery did not make immediate sense. She had more wealth and influence than anyone else in the family. She did not need to steal from the organization. But as I studied the pattern more carefully, the logic appeared. The funds were not disappearing. They were being repositioned. Quietly transferred into a reserve that existed outside Junsiek's control. A shadow treasury. If something ever happened to his leadership, that money could finance a new structure loyal only to her. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the screen for a long time after realizing what it meant. Madam Park had spent decades building the family empire. She trusted no one completely, not even her own son. If investigators ever discovered those transfers, someone would have to take responsibility. The perfect suspect was already standing inside the house. A foreign daughter-in-law with financial training and partial access to the records. Me. Once I understood that, my fear faded and something else replaced it. Calculation. I began documenting everything. Not digitally where files could disappear, but in a black leather ledger I kept hidden behind the books in my closet. Every transaction, every date, every account number went onto those pages in careful handwriting. Over 3 months the ledger filled with evidence. 126 separate transfers forming a trail that could not be ignored. I wrote quietly while the family slept, knowing that eventually the truth would surface. When the federal seizure happened, and the council accused me of betrayal, I was not surprised. I only felt confirmation that the plan unfolding around me was exactly what I had expected. The conference room for the federal hearing sat on the 22nd floor of a glass tower overlooking Elliott Bay. From the outside, the building looked like any other corporate law office in downtown Seattle, but inside the atmosphere carried the quiet pressure of something much heavier. This was where organizations like ours tried to solve problems before those problems reached a courtroom. The meeting had been arranged between the Park family attorneys and a federal compliance team that had begun circling our shipping network after the container seizure. If the lawyers could present a convincing explanation and a responsible party, the investigation might stop there. If they failed, the government would dig deeper, and every business tied to the family could fall under scrutiny. When I entered the conference room that morning, the air already felt thick with expectation. The long table held nearly everyone who mattered inside the organization. 12 council members sat along the sides, their expressions rigid with controlled anxiety. Our legal team occupied one end with folders stacked neatly beside them. At the center sat Junsiek, dressed in a dark tailored suit that made him look calm and immovable even as tension crept into his posture. Madam Park sat beside him like a quiet monument, her back straight, her hands resting lightly against the polished table. She had not acknowledged me when I walked in. That was consistent with the story the family had agreed to tell. In their version of events, I was already outside the circle. Across from them waited 2 federal attorneys and a financial investigator whose job was to listen carefully while the family offered its explanation. The meeting was not a trial, but the structure felt dangerously close to one. Every word spoken inside that room would shape what happened next. The lead lawyer from our side stood once everyone had taken their seats. His voice carried the careful tone of someone who had rehearsed each sentence. He explained that the Park family had conducted its own internal review after the seizure of the container shipment. The review, he said, had identified a breach in financial confidentiality that likely allowed government agencies to trace the shipment through our network of companies. The family regretted the error and had already taken steps to remove the individual responsible from any further involvement in financial operations. Then he said my name, Naomi Carter Park. The words floated across the room like a verdict that had already been accepted. Several council members shifted slightly in their chairs, but did not challenge the statement. From their perspective, this solution was clean. One mistake, one outsider removed. The organization would move forward intact. The federal investigator turned toward me with professional curiosity. He did not look angry. He looked interested, as if the story might still change. Mrs. Park, he asked calmly, do you have anything you wish to add before we continue? Every person at the table expected one of 2 reactions. They expected denial or desperation. Either would confirm the narrative that had already been written. Instead, I reached into the leather bag resting beside my chair and removed a black ledger no thicker than a paperback novel. I placed it gently on the center of the table. The quiet sound of the cover touching polished wood seemed louder than any argument. I do, I said. For 3 months before the container seizure, I continued, I noticed irregularities in the internal transfers between several of the family's companies. At the time, I attempted to raise the concern privately, but my observations were dismissed. After that, I began documenting the transactions for my own records. The lead lawyer frowned slightly, unsure where the explanation was going. One of the council members leaned forward. Junsiek watched me with an expression I had not seen before, something between confusion and sudden awareness. The federal investigator gestured toward the ledger. May we? I nodded and pushed it across the table. The investigator opened the first page and immediately saw columns of careful handwriting. Dates, account numbers, transaction codes, and routing paths. Every entry was cross-referenced with the company that initiated the transfer and the account that ultimately received the funds. He flipped through several pages, the rhythm of turning paper becoming the only sound in the room. Please turn to page 47, I said quietly. He did. The lawyer beside him leaned closer to read. Page 47 marked the point where the scattered transactions began forming a single pattern. From there forward, every line pointed to the same destination account hidden behind a charitable trust. The investigator read the account name aloud slowly. The words seemed to hang in the air for several seconds before anyone reacted. Park Cultural Foundation. Another page turned. Another transaction. Another transfer. The investigator stopped turning pages and lifted his eyes toward the table. "Mrs. Park," he said carefully, "who authorized these movements?" I did not answer. Instead, I looked toward the other end of the table where Madam Park sat perfectly still. The silence stretched long enough for every person in the room to understand what the documents implied. Finally, the investigator asked the question that no one inside the family had ever dared to form out loud. "Madam Park," he said, "did you approve these transfers?" For the first time since I had known her, the matriarch of the Park family did not respond immediately. Junsiek reached for the ledger and began turning pages himself. I watched the moment the numbers registered in his mind. His shoulders stiffened. The careful mask he wore in business meetings began to crack as he followed the trail of transactions across the pages. Each line connected the same way, forming a structure too precise to dismiss as coincidence. Across the table, the council members exchanged uncertain glances. The solution they had agreed upon only hours earlier had begun collapsing in front of them. I folded my hands calmly on the table and waited. Because for 3 months I had prepared for this exact moment. And now the truth was finally speaking louder than anyone's silence. The silence that followed the investigator's question seemed to drain the air from the room. No one moved. The council members who had spent years speaking with absolute confidence now avoided looking at one another. Madam Park remained perfectly composed, her hands still resting on the table as if nothing unusual had happened. For a moment I wondered whether she would simply deny everything and rely on the authority she had built over decades. In this family, reputation often mattered more than facts. But the ledger lay open between us, its pages filled with numbers that did not care about loyalty or hierarchy. Junsiek continued flipping through the pages slowly. I watched the exact moment the realization reached him. His breathing changed first, then his eyes moved faster across the lines of handwriting, as if he were searching for some explanation that would undo what he was seeing. There was none. The pattern was too precise. Every entry connected back to the same account hidden behind the Park Cultural Foundation. The shadow treasury his mother had quietly constructed without his knowledge. One of the council members cleared his throat. "This could still be a misunderstanding," he said cautiously, though the uncertainty in his voice betrayed him. "There may be a strategic reason these funds were moved." The federal investigator did not look convinced. He turned another page, scanning the columns carefully. "These transfers began nearly 3 months before the container seizure," he said. "They appear to have been executed through multiple shell companies designed to obscure the final destination. That level of structuring usually indicates intent." His gaze moved once more to Madam Park. For several seconds she remained silent. Then she finally lifted her eyes from the table and looked directly at him. When she spoke, her voice was calm and measured, the same tone she had used for years when guiding the family through crises. "The foundation manages many financial programs," she said. "Some transfers may have been routed through it for charitable purposes." The explanation might have sounded reasonable to someone unfamiliar with the system. But everyone in that room knew how carefully the organization's financial channels were normally controlled. Charity funds did not move secretly through operational accounts. Junsiek closed the ledger and placed both hands on the table. The room seemed to lean toward him. He was the head of the family now. Whatever he said next would shape what happened to all of us. "Mother," he said quietly, "did you authorize these transactions?" For the first time in the entire meeting, Madam Park hesitated. It was only a brief pause, but it echoed louder than any confession. The council members noticed it immediately. Their loyalty had always been rooted in strength and certainty. Hesitation unsettled them. Madam Park finally answered. "I moved funds into a separate reserve," she said. "A precaution. The organization faces many risks. I believed it was wise to prepare for instability." Her words were careful. They admitted just enough truth to remain credible, while avoiding the larger implication. But the federal investigator leaned back in his chair, considering her explanation with quiet skepticism. "Were these transfers disclosed to the operational leadership of the organization?" he asked. Junsiek did not respond immediately. His eyes were still on the ledger. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded different, stripped of the calm authority he normally carried into business meetings. "No," he said. A ripple of tension moved through the council. The investigator folded his hands. "Then we have a serious internal governance issue," he said. "From the government's perspective, undisclosed financial movements tied to an intercepted shipment create the appearance of deliberate concealment." No one needed the implication explained. If the authorities decided the family had intentionally hidden funds connected to the shipment, the investigation would widen far beyond a single container. Junsiek looked up from the table and met my eyes for the first time since the hearing began. I could see the conflict moving through him. On one side sat the woman who had built the empire he now led. On the other side sat the wife he had allowed the council to accuse. The room waited. Finally he stood. The quiet scrape of his chair against the floor seemed impossibly loud. Junsiek turned first toward the council members who had followed his family for years. His voice was steady now, though the weight of the moment pressed against every word. "The accusation against Naomi was made under the assumption that she had access to the financial records and misused that access," he said. "But the evidence presented today shows that she was documenting irregularities, not creating them." Several council members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Junsiek continued, his gaze moving slowly across the room. "The woman we allowed you to accuse was the only person protecting this family." The statement hung in the air like a verdict no one could challenge. The investigator wrote something in his notebook. The family lawyers exchanged tense glances, already calculating how the narrative would need to change to limit the damage. Madame Park said nothing. Her expression remained composed, but the control she had always carried into every room felt weaker now, like a structure that had developed its first visible crack. I did not speak either. There was no need. For months I had prepared for this moment, carefully recording every transfer while the family dismissed my concerns. I had waded through the accusations, through the humiliation of being treated as an outsider who could not be trusted. I had watched my husband choose silence when a single word might have defended me. But evidence had its own voice, and now that voice filled the room, louder than power, louder than loyalty, louder even than the long traditions that had once kept me invisible. For several seconds after Junsiek spoke, no one in the room seemed capable of responding. The council members who had confidently agreed to sacrifice me now sat motionless, their authority suddenly uncertain. The lawyers whispered quietly among themselves, already adjusting their strategy in light of the evidence now resting in the center of the table. Across from them, the federal investigator closed the ledger with careful hands, as if recognizing that the pages contained more than financial records. They contained the story the family had tried to bury. He turned slightly toward Junsiek. "From the government's perspective," he said calmly, "the existence of these undocumented transfers suggests internal financial misconduct rather than external betrayal. If the organization is willing to correct the issue and cooperate with further clarification, we may be able to limit the scope of our inquiry." It was not forgiveness, but it was an opening. Junsiek nodded once. "The family will cooperate," he said. His voice had regained its steadiness, but I could see the exhaustion behind it. For the first time since the meeting began, he looked older than his reputation. The investigator gathered the ledger and slid it back across the table toward me. "Mrs. Park," he said, "your documentation appears thorough. If we require additional clarification, our office will contact the family attorneys." I nodded politely and closed the book. The room slowly began to move again. Chairs shifted. Papers were collected. Conversations restarted in cautious tones. But the center of gravity in that room had changed. The narrative that had placed blame on me no longer existed. Madame Park rose from her chair without speaking. For decades people had followed her decisions without hesitation. Now, as she walked toward the door, several council members watched her with a kind of quiet uncertainty that had never existed before. Junsiek remained where he was. The others eventually filed out, leaving the room almost empty. Only the distant sounds of elevators and office phones filtered faintly through the walls. When the door finally closed behind the last lawyer, Junsiek exhaled slowly and leaned both hands on the table. "Why did you wait?" he asked. I knew what he meant. Why had I allowed the accusation to unfold instead of confronting his mother immediately? I looked down at the ledger resting in my hands. The cover was worn slightly along the edges from months of careful handling. If I had told you earlier, I said quietly, you would have believed her. Junseok did not argue. That silence told me I was right. I slipped the ledger into my bag and stood. The afternoon light from the tall windows stretched across the conference table, turning the polished wood a warm shade of gold. For the first time in months, the weight that had followed me through every room felt lighter. I did not expose her to punish the family, I continued. I documented the truth so that when the moment came, no one could ignore it. Junseok looked at me for a long time. There was regret in his eyes now, and something deeper that had not existed before. Recognition. Not of my loyalty, of my strength. In the world Junseok had built, power usually came from intimidation, wealth, or influence. But that afternoon proved something far more dangerous. Sometimes the most powerful person in the room was not the one who spoke the loudest. Sometimes it was the one who simply kept the record. 6 months earlier, I stood in a room full of powerful men who believed I was the weakest person at the table. A wife who hosted dinners. A woman who smiled politely and stayed quiet. Someone easy to blame when something went wrong. What they never understood was that invisibility can be a dangerous advantage. When people stop paying attention to you, they also stop hiding the truth. And the truth, once written down carefully enough, eventually becomes impossible to ignore. I did not raise my voice. I did not destroy the family. I simply refused to disappear.